Sure.
I'm consenting.
Recording is on. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I started it.
That's nice. That's nice.
I'm going to pause the recording.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Even though you probably heard our chit chat, I will just start again, just to remind everybody that you're joining us today for the MindCORE Summer Seminar Series. So we are on our second to last speaker this week, and just a few housekeeping things that we always go over. Yesterday's talk with John Truswell, you're already familiar with this, but this is a new format for us this week. And so if you have any questions during the presentation, just go ahead and write them in the chat, and I will make sure I take a look at them, and we can, if it's a question where there's an opportunity for it to come up, I'll sort of wave, and we can ask the question during the presentation. Otherwise, just hang on to it. We'll make sure we get to them at the end. Let me see. One other reminder is that MindCORE is the interdisciplinary center for the study of mind and brain within the University of Pennsylvania, and we're housed in the School of Medicine. And we have programming for students, and we have funding for research, and we have some educational programs. We're also the home for the CogSci major at Penn. And so you can learn more about what MindCORE does on our website, and I'll go ahead and paste that in the chat once we get started. And so now I'd like to turn over to our speaker today, who's Professor Ruscio, and she is going to give us with telling us a little bit about how she got into the field of research that she did and sort of what inspired her, and any other sort of tips for students who are on their own research journey. I mean, sorry, you don't have to get that broad, but anything that
I'm happy to get that broad in questions if people would like. Okay,
good. All right. Thanks. And so without anything else, I hate it when people say further ado. We'll do it. So without speaking any further, I'll turn it over. Thank you, Professor Ruscio.
Well done. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here. So as Heather said, I'm Ayelet Ruscio. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm a professor in the psychology department. And Jessica asked me to begin by speaking briefly about how I study. And to be honest, I cannot imagine anything more fascinating than studying abnormal human behavior. So I study psychopathology, which is the subfield of psychology that's concerned with the study, diagnosis, and treatment of abnormal behavior. And more specifically, I study anxiety and depression, two of the most debilitating forms of mental illness in the world. So one of the things that draws me to this area of study is that research on this area has the potential to reduce suffering and improve people's lives. In addition to conducting research and teaching, I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. And this means that I can use what scientists have learned about these mental health problems to help clients through assessment and therapy. It also means that I can learn from my clients and use that knowledge to inform my theories and my research. Today, I'd like to share with you some of my research on the nature and boundaries of worry. And I hope to give you a taste of some of the challenges and opportunities involved in studying this intriguing and sometimes cognitively incapacitating process. I'll briefly describe 4 studies that illustrate different approaches that my students and I have used to identify characteristics of pathological worry. Now, as I mentioned, psychopathology is concerned with abnormal behavior. But how should we define abnormal behavior? Where is the threshold between normality and abnormality? Now, I think this is a question that is important for all forms of psychopathology, but it may be especially important for anxiety and depression. Anxiety, fear, and sadness are things that we all experience to some degree, and this makes the challenge of distinguishing normal emotions from emotional disturbance, quite difficult. So to illustrate this point, let's take a look at worry. So psychologists define worry as a negative, relatively uncontrollable chain of thoughts concerning a future event whose outcome is uncertain. So when we worry, we are basically talking to ourselves about bad things that might happen in the future. Now, worry has been linked to the essential human capacity to anticipate possible danger or threat and thus to adapt and plan for the future. Now, none of us has any experience with worry, right? Okay, so I'm guessing you guys are shaking your heads because I can't see you, but this is really a conundrum that worry presents for us, right? Most people worry, and many people worry quite frequently and even intensely without being considered to have a mental illness. At the same time, worry is the defining feature of generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, a common and disabling anxiety disorder. We consider worry to be a sign of a disorder when it's chronic, excessive, and difficult to control, when it is associated with other symptoms of anxiety, such as muscle tension and hypervigilance, and when it causes clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning. Now, these diagnostic criteria, which set the threshold between normal and pathological worry, have important implications for researchers, for clinicians, and for the public. So for example, the diagnostic threshold for GAD influences how we think about and conceptualize the disorder and the types of causal models that we develop to try to understand what causes someone to shift from normal to pathological worry. It influences estimates of the prevalence of the disorder and thus influences policy decisions and the allocation of resources toward prevention and treatment of the disorder. It influences how we go about studying the disorder. Which individuals will we include or exclude from our studies of pathological worry? How will we construct measures for assessing worry? It influences how well we're able to predict the course and outcome of the disorder. And the better a job we do at setting the boundaries of GAD, the better we may be able to predict who is going to benefit from treatment and which treatment will best benefit each individual. Boundary is also important for fiscal and public health consequences. So consider that in the Veterans Administration and the Social Security system, an individual may have access to clinical care and to disability payments only if they can establish that they qualify for a recognized mental disorder. So where we set the diagnostic threshold can influence who receives benefits and who has access to clinical care. So given the considerable influence of these diagnostic criteria, it seems how good a job they do in separating out a group of pathological worriers whose experiences differ from those of normal worriers who don't qualify for the diagnosis. Now, many investigators have studied this boundary by comparing individuals with GAD to those of normal worriers who don't qualify for the diagnosis. And these studies have found many, many differences between these two groups of GAD worriers and healthy controls. So for example, individuals with GAD spend a larger percentage of their time worrying. They tend to worry about minor things that many of us don't worry about, like for an appointment or completing homework on time, for example. And they're more likely to interpret ambiguous external information as more threatening than individuals without GAD. Now, at first glance, differences such as these appear to suggest that this diagnostic threshold for GAD represents a meaningful boundary for pathological worry. However, nearly all of these studies compared GAD diagnosed individuals to people who were selected to have minimal levels of worry and anxiety. Clinical psychologists refer to these controls as supernormals because they have such low levels of worry and anxiety that it's like, where did these people come from? Who are they, right? So this problem can be seen in this graph, which comes from a study that I conducted a long time ago, which uses scores from the Penn State Worry Questionnaire, or the PSWQ. This is a questionnaire that assesses people's trait levels of worry, the typical levels of worry that they experience, and how intense and uncontrollable that worry tends to be. What we see here is the score distribution for individuals without GAD, this is our gray bars, as well as a score distribution for individuals with GAD, that's the black bars in this distribution of scores. So a couple of things I can point out in these data. First of all, we see a nice unimodal kind of normal distribution of scores. This is what worry scores tend to look like. So you can see that these low worriers are quite anomalous. Most people actually experience moderate levels of worry, not very low levels. So, you know, these are the people we tend to compare individuals in our studies. And I don't know who these people are. They could be surfer dudes, they might be psychopaths. I have no idea, but they tell us, I never worry, I'm never anxious, okay? I think what's more interesting actually are the people over here. These are the people who worry a lot. The vast majority of them do not have GAD. And I think that's actually quite fascinating. So who are these individuals who experience severe levels of worry, but who don't have GAD? What distinguishes them from the diagnosed individuals who we consider to have pathological worry? So to begin answering this question, we recruited a sample of high worriers. These were college students with GAD by our lab, and the other half did not have GAD. And we designed this study so that the groups were matched in their levels of trait worry. So instead of comparing the people with GAD to supernormals who have no worry at all, we actually recruited for each person in the GAD group, we recruited someone for the non-GAD group who had an identical score on the Penn State Worry Questionnaire. So same level of trait worry. And we began by examining these groups' thoughts about their worrying to see whether they differ in their appraisals of worry. We used Wells Metacognition's questionnaire. And in addition to comparing the people with GAD to other without the disorder, we also compared these groups to an unselected sample of 306 students to determine whether severe worry, even in the absence of GAD, is associated with different perceptions of worry than the perceptions that most people hold. So let me show you some of our results. First, we found that positive beliefs about worry are universal. They were reported equally by all three of our groups. General awareness of thoughts was elevated among all high worriers, regardless of their GAD status. However, negative beliefs about worry appear to be of GAD. So even compared to equally worried, severe worriers, GAD worriers were differentiated by having a high level of self-doubt about their cognitive abilities, by endorsing superstitious beliefs about worry. So things like the belief that if I don't worry about something, it's more likely to actually happen, and by perceptions of worry as dangerous and out of their control. We next look to see whether these robust group differences in beliefs about worry correspond to actual differences in the experience of worry. But how do we measure the covert process of worry without disrupting or changing it? This is a reference many psychologists who study private internal processes. We're curious about what's going on in people's minds, but by measuring it, disrupt the process or change it in some way. So we addressed this in this study by having the same 60 high worry students complete an attention-focused task before and after a worry induction. So this study had 3 separate phases. In the first phase, participants were asked to focus all of their attention on their breathing. In the second phase, they were asked to worry about a topic that was currently worrying them in their life in the usual way that they worry about it. That was our worry induction. And in the third and final phase, they were asked to focus all of their attention on their breathing again. Each of these 3 phases lasted for 5 minutes. We assessed people's cognitive experiences at 8 points, 4 before the worry induction and 4 after it, using periodic thought sampling. So each time they were signaled, we sort of had a little beeping sound. Participants were whether at the time the beeper sounded, they were completely focused on their breathing, distracted by positive thoughts, negative thoughts, or neutral thoughts, or other. The sorts of things we got for other was I had a song running through my head, or I was like concentrating on the rumbling in my stomach because I'm hungry, for example. So by sampling thoughts in real time, we were able to assess worry or thought intrusions as they were taking place, rather than relying on the sorts of global summaries we get on questionnaires that are heavily influenced by people's general perceptions about their worry experiences. So let me orient you to the graph that shows our results. So what you can see here are the 8 thought samples that we took during this task. These are the 4 thought samples that we took at random intervals prior to the worry induction. The worry induction happened right here. And here are the final 4 thought samples that were taken after the worry induction. And what we can see, the proportion of individuals with GAD and without GAD who reported being distracted by negative thoughts at the time they were signaled at each of these different 8 different thought samples. So what you can see is that induced worry, which happened right here, led to a significant increase in subsequent negative for both worry groups, the GAD group and the high worry non-GAD group. However, GAD worriers experienced a significantly greater increase in negative intrusions than non-GAD worriers immediately after the worry induction. You can see that right here. However, and quite interestingly, this differential increase in intrusions was short-lived. It disappeared by the next thought sample. And although there are several possible explanations for this finding, the explanation that's best supported in this study and in other studies we've done suggests that pathological worriers may be distinguished more by their views of their worry as problematic than by differences in worry experiences from other high worriers. So this really underscores the importance of measuring worry as close in time as possible to its occurrence, rather than relying on global questionnaires which entangle actual worry experiences with people's beliefs or perceptions about those experiences. Now, up to now, we've focused just on worry. But does worry tell the whole story? Does it fully capture the cognitive experiences of these individuals? Well, researchers traditionally have focused on worry as a core component of anxiety and especially GAD. However, a parallel body of research has shown that many individuals engage in a characteristic way of thinking called rumination. And although rumination has been defined in a number of different ways, the definitions generally refer to a repetitive and passive style of thinking about the present and the past, especially past loss and failure. So we often see clinically as individuals with depression who sort of sit and stew in their head about all the things they've done wrong, how bad they feel, how terrible things have been that have gotten them to this point. Now, worry and rumination appear to share some important similarities. They both reflect a very abstract style of thinking as opposed to more concrete thinking. They're both highly verbal. There's very little visual cognition that goes on in these processes. They're verbal linguistic, and they're very passive. In addition, they involve dwelling persistently on negative aspects of the self, as well as on largely unsolvable problems in one's life. So this raises the possibility, these similarities between worry and rumination raise the possibility that a tendency to get stuck in negative repetitive thinking is shared by anxiety and depression. And it also suggests that we may need to push beyond our narrow focus on worry to studying perseverative thinking or negative repetitive thinking more broadly. To examine this possibility, we measured worry and rumination that was experienced in the wake of stressful events in the natural environment. And to do this, we used ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. So EMA is an intensive data collection method in which participants experiences multiple times per day, usually in response to a signal. In this study, we recruited a sample of 145 individuals from Philadelphia who were assigned by clinical interview to one of 4 groups. We had healthy controls who had no current or past pathology. We had individuals with GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, or anxious group. We had individuals with major depressive disorder, or depressed group. And we had a comorbid group who qualified for a diagnosis of both GAD and major depression. So they had a mixture of anxiety and depression. So participants completed a 7-day experience sampling week, during which they were signaled by a handheld electronic device at 8 random times per day. And each time they were signaled, participants were asked to reflect back on the most significant event occurring since the last signal. They rated the event on how stressful it was for them. And they also were asked to rate the level of worry and rumination they experienced immediately after the event on separate 1 to 5 scales. So rumination was assessed by 2 statements. They were asked immediately after the event. I was dwelling on my mistakes, failures, or losses. I kept thinking about something negative that has happened. And worry was assessed by 2 statements. I was worrying about how things could turn out. I kept thinking about something bad that could happen. Each of these 4 statements was rated on separate 1 to 5 scales. This graph shows average levels of emotion immediately after stressful events in the 4 groups. So I'd like to draw your attention to several patterns in the data. First, anxious and depressed individuals were much more likely than controls, or normal worriers, to perseverate in the aftermath of stressful events. You see these bars are substantially higher than these bars, showing the mean or average levels of worry and rumination after the stressor. For the clinical groups, both worry, shown in the dark bar, and rumination, shown in the striped bar, were common in the aftermath of stress. And the GAD group, the anxious individuals, and the MDD group, the depressed individuals, did not differ in their worry levels or their rumination levels. Perseveration levels were particularly high among individuals with both disorders. And these group differences remain significant even after we adjusted for event stressfulness. So this is really important because it tells us that the differences in we're seeing across these groups is not due to the fact that some of the groups experienced higher levels of stress than other groups did. So what can we take from these results? Well, I think the results suggest that GAD is not uniquely associated with worry, nor is major depression uniquely associated with rumination. Instead, both forms of perseverative thought were elevated in the clinical groups relative to healthy controls. That said, we only studied perseverative responses to negative events. Might pathological perseverators have trouble controlling their cognitions or cognitive responses to other kinds of stimuli as well? We don't. Another limitation is that we sample thoughts approximately once every 90 minutes. This is very typical for studies that use ecological momentary assessment, but it misses the opportunity to trace how these thoughts unfold over time. And this is a common problem in this literature. When people don't use global questionnaires to assess worry or rumination, they generally assess these thoughts at intervals of hours when we study daily life, or minutes when we study these processes in the lab. But we know from clinical accounts that perseverative thought unfolds more rapidly than this, typically over the course of seconds. And we were interested in trying to temporal resolution that would allow us to really get a window into what happens when people worry or ruminate. So we developed a joystick device that measures perseverative thought unobtrusively in real time. And you can see here a picture of this joystick. The joystick values center on 0. So in the neutral position, as you see here, that's a value of 0. And the values range all the way from -10 when the joystick is pulled all the way back toward the respondent, all the way to +10 when the joystick is extended as far away from the respondent as possible. So we have a -10 to a +10 range. The joystick location is recorded at a rate of 4 values per second. So this provides a much more fine-grained measure of the progression of thought over time than we've been able to get with these periodic thought samples we've been doing. So we use the joystick to investigate what sorts of stimuli trigger thought intrusions in people with varying levels of trait perseverative thought. In this sample, we included 77 community dwelling adults who varied widely in their trait levels of perseverative thought. 56 individuals had GAD or major depression or both. So you can see that the sample was enriched for high or severe levels of perseverative thought. We also included healthy controls, and these were not supernormal controls. They were individuals who were deliberately selected to represent a wide range of perseverative thought. So the participants listened to a series of 36 brief scenarios depicting possible life events. And after listening to each scenario, the participants were asked to sit quietly until the next scenario was presented. And during this 30-second interval, they used the joystick to rate the thought valence, positive or negative, and intensity of their thoughts continuously, again, using the device for 30 seconds. So we didn't tell them we wanted them to think about this scenario more, or we didn't instruct them on what we wanted them to think about. We simply asked them to use the joystick to track their thoughts in real time until the next stimulus was presented. So I wanted to give you a sense for what these scenarios look like. I have a few examples I wanted to share with you. So one of the negative scenarios was your significant others of 2 years breaks up with you without warning. Pretty clearly a negative life event. One of the positive scenarios was you're accepted to your first choice graduate school with a scholarship offer. Others cheering over there. Yep, that's clearly positive. You also had ambiguous scenarios, like your mom says she has something important to tell you later today. So you can imagine that this could be interpreted in a positive light. Boy, mom has some good news to share with me. Or it could be negative, we don't know. And final category was neutral events, like the cashier rings up your drink order at the local coffee shop. Okay, so take a moment to think about these scenarios. How would you react if you imagine these scenarios happening to you? How negative or positive would your thoughts be after thinking about these scenarios? So let me show you what our participants thought about. So these data show the average joystick values for the 4 types of event stimuli: negative, positive, ambiguous, and neutral. And we see these values in individuals with varying levels of trait perseverative thought. So here, all the way at the left of the x-axis, we see peoples with the lowest levels of perseverative thought in our sample, extending all the way up to the people who have the highest levels of perseverative thought in the sample. So let me kind of work with you through these results. So first we see that, as we expected, people with higher levels of trait perseverative thought reported more negative thought intrusions following negative scenarios. So we see that line gets lower, showing more intensely negative joystick values in the aftermath of listening to these negative scenarios. We see almost the same pattern of findings for ambiguous scenarios. Okay, so the higher your trait perseverative thought, the more likely you are to have these more intense negative thought intrusions after listening to the ambiguous scenarios. Trait perseverative thought did not predict thought intrusions after neutral scenarios. Unexpectedly, participants with higher trait perseverative thought reported more intense positive thoughts after listening to positive scenarios. So this suggests that perseverative thought is associated with more intense cognitive responses to emotional stimuli, regardless of the valence of those stimuli. And all of these patterns held even after we adjusted for clinical status. So when we account for the fact that some of our participants had anxiety or depressive disorders and others did not, the pattern was the same. Okay. Next, we took advantage of the time series data to examine the temporal dynamics of the thoughts. So the pattern of results I just showed you were averages across the 30-minute periods. But we actually have, as you know, 4 data points per second for 30 seconds. So this really allows us to look at the thoughts over time. And in particular, we were interested in how perseverative or sticky the thoughts were after people were exposed to these different. And so we did this by examining differences between joystick values that were 5 seconds apart or 10 seconds apart in the time series. So the idea is that if my joystick value right now is very similar to my joystick value 10 seconds from now, that is a more sticky pattern of thoughts than if the joystick now was very different from my thoughts currently. So here's what we found. After listening to the negative and ambiguous scenarios, participants with higher trait perseverative thought had more stable, more sticky joystick values than participants with lower trait perseverative thought. We found the opposite pattern after positive scenarios, where higher trait perseverative thought was associated with more variable, less sticky. So after listening to negative or neutral scenarios, the thoughts were more stable over time. Whereas after listening to positive scenarios, the thoughts were less stable than normal. Those positive values changed very quickly. So these results suggest that trait perseverative thought is associated with heightened cognitive responses to non-neutral stimuli. In addition, that high trait perseverators have trouble disengaging from negative or potentially negative thoughts, but But do these results hold up in the natural environment? As psychologists, we love to study things in the lab because we have a lot of control over what happens. So in the lab, I can control the stimuli people are exposed to. I can control how long they're exposed to those stimuli. And so I can experience across participants, which increases internal validity. But ultimately, what I want to know is, what are people experiencing in their daily lives? And so we wanted to take this out into the natural environment. So to do that, we went back to ecological momentary assessment. Now, as I told you before, ecological momentary assessment has given us the opportunity to see what happens in people's lives, but we were interested in tracing thought episodes as they unfold in real time. So we weren't satisfied with sampling thoughts just once every 90 minutes, which is what's typical in these EMA studies. So instead, we, in order to trace the progression of thought episodes outside the lab, we developed a new ecological momentary assessment approach that we called rapid sampling EMA. And we did this by using a smartphone app to collect a series of very brief repeated thought samples. And by rapid, I mean 4 surveys over 10 minutes. So instead of sampling people once every 90 minutes on average, we assessed people 4 times over a 10-minute period. And in addition, we customized the survey content in response to changes in the thoughts over time. So that means that individuals who reported worry at a particular point in time would get different questions at the next assessment than individuals who reported they were not worrying at the prior assessment. Now, in this initial feasibility study, we focused solely on worry. And our goal was to begin to study what happens during a worry episode. So we recruited a sample of 75 community-dwelling adults with various levels of trait worry. Our goal was to represent the whole range from very low to very high and everything in between. And the participants were signaled in each of 3 blocks in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening to report on the thought they were having at that moment. And then over the subsequent 10 minutes, they had received these 3 follow-up surveys to trace the progression of the thought in real time. And we did this over a period of 4 days. We found that participants with higher trait worry experienced greater persistence of worried thoughts within a block. So across those 4 brief surveys, the more likely to report still worrying, I'm still worrying, I'm still worrying. Greater intrusion of worried thoughts after the thought episode ended. So there were some individuals at some signals who were worrying and then not worrying and then worrying again, suggesting a resurgence or a recurrence of the worry. And perhaps not surprisingly, these persistent and recurrent worries led to greater interference of worry in people's daily activities by their reports. So as we found in the lab, high trait worriers appear to have trouble disengaging from negative thoughts in daily life. And we also learned that perseveration can unfold in at least 2 ways. There's a persistent pattern where people are consistently level, and a recurrent pattern where people start off worrying, are able to stop worrying, but then have this rebound effect where they start worrying again over a relatively short period of time. We're now analyzing additional questions that were embedded in these surveys to identify predictors of when worry will persist and recur and when worry terminates. We want to try to understand what's associated with a prolonged worry episode or bout and what's associated with being able to successfully turn off worries in daily life. So I've presented you with results from 4 different studies, and I want to take a moment to synthesize the results in some conclusion. So while there may be some objective differences in how they experience worry, high worriers falling on either side of the GAD boundary are most robustly distinguished by their subjective appraisals of worry and its consequences. Second, high worriers are often high ruminators as well. And because we're in rumination, similarities and co-occur in anxious and depressed people, advances may be accelerated by studying worry and rumination together under the broader construct of perseverative thought, rather than continuing to maintain these separate studies and separate research literatures on worry and rumination, which is our current state of the field. Third, high perception cognitive responses to a wide range of emotional stimuli, not only negative stimuli, but ambiguous and positive stimuli as well. high perseverators have particular difficulty disengaging from negative thoughts. And this difficulty may manifest as persistent negative thoughts or as thoughts that resolve but then recur over time. I described some new approaches that we're using to measure thought episodes as they unfold in real time. And these sorts of approaches might be useful for measuring other rapidly unfolding psychological processes as well, in particular in the area of emotion and affective science. We're really excited by the approaches to teach us how and why people worry, and when worry becomes pathological, hopefully paving the way for interventions to prevent uncontrollable, distressing thoughts in daily life. I hope this has given you a sense, or at least a flavor of the sorts of questions we pursue in our clinical psychology laboratory. And if you'd like to learn more about our work or get involved in our research, I invite you to reach out to me directly or check out our website, which I have included on this slide. If you'd like to learn more about anxiety, depression, or other forms of psychopathology, I teach our department's abnormal psychology course every spring and would love to see you there. I'd like to acknowledge the many individuals who contributed to the work that I presented today, including graduate and undergraduate researchers. Our research assistants are absolutely essential to all that we do, collaborating scientists at other institutions, and our funders as well. Thank you so much for your attention. It was a pleasure to talk with you, answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. So we actually have a question. This comes from Melanie. Have you considered using physical measurements such as heart rate, breathing rate, eye movement, grip strength on the joystick, etc., to track the change in primed emotional states, which such an investigation offers strength to your hypotheses?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. That's a great question. So we actually have in several of our studies incorporated psychophysiological measures. One of the things that's really intriguing to think about is what are the right measures to use. There has been research that has connected worry with certain types of autonomic measures, but not with others. So like trying to make sure like heart rate, generally speaking, is not something that is strongly associated with worry, but there are some measures that are associated. So we have incorporated those physiological measures into our work. They tend to not be specific to worry, right? These are measures that are also elevated in other experiences of negative emotion. And so it can really enrich our understanding of the experience, the internal experience the individual is having as they are exposed to these stimuli. But it's not, I don't think it's the case that we can use these physiological measures on their own as a proxy for how much someone worries, because it seems to be capturing more than just the worry experience that the person is having, may tap more closely to affect. Pupil dilation is a really interesting measure because we have not used that in our research. I think that's a direction in which I think it would be really exciting to move in. Pupil dilation measures several things. One of the things it seems to capture or index is sustained cognitive processing, and that fits very nicely with a model of what people are doing when they perseverate. But it also measures other things like the salience of a stimulus, for example. So we need to combine measurements of pupil dilation with other measures to make sure that what we're capturing with the pupil dilation measure is really worry or rumination as opposed to something else. I love the idea of grip strength on the joystick. I've never thought of that. That's really intriguing and something for us to think more about. Thanks for that suggestion.
I invite our participants to post another question, but while I'm looking for somebody to post something, I'm curious actually just about the joystick itself. So is that somebody in your lab who designed that, or who actually assembled it, or is that something, where did that come from?
Yeah, this is actually a joystick that was created by the psychology shop back when we had a shop in our psychology department. So it's a custom joystick device. That said, we have recently sort of looked into the possibility of switching over to a commercially manufactured joystick device. And that was not something that was really, there weren't joysticks available at the time we were starting this research line of research that seemed to suit our purposes, but there's a lot more options available now for joysticks. So I think that for the next project, we might shift over to something that's sort of more standard and commercially available.
And the app made me think of the same thing. Was that something that you developed, or was that something that you were able to source somewhere else?
It was something that we customized from an existing app. So it was an app that had been developed by researchers at Cornell to study other things that we thought could be used for this purpose. And they worked with us to customize the app for the particular the timing of we wanted to use in our rapid sampling ecological momentary assessment. Again, EMA software has evolved over time, and I think that there is commercially available software available that could potentially be used now to do that work. So all of these developments are really good because it means that more researchers have access to the technology to incorporate these measures in their work.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how I'm constantly sort of amazed about all of the things you kind of have to be able to, if not be an expert in, at least dabble in successfully as somebody who runs a research lab. And so actually crafting, a device, a tool that will help you measure these things, and then apps it's just kind of incredible.
Yeah,
I think you're asked for.
I think that's true, and I think that this really speaks to the importance of collaboration. So you can have, as a scientist, you can have sort of a vision of, wouldn't it be cool if we could do X? But then oftentimes, in order to really instantiate that, you need to find individuals who have that expertise and can join with you to actually make that a reality. And we've been really fortunate at Penn to have sort of collaborators who have helped us sort of bring our vision to life, and also working with people at other institutions who have relevant expertise to bear, enrich our work and what we can do.
Just one more thing I was thinking about with the tool, just because I think it's kind of interesting, is we learned yesterday when John Truswell spoke that actually one of our summer interns is working on eye tracking for online platforms, and so. Nice. That's kind of interesting. We'll be
interesting.
See where that goes.
Yeah, I wonder how precise that is. One of the things that we've started to investigate, the different eye tracking devices that are available, and the research grade ones are like these big honking things that sit on your head, and you have to have very little movement of the head in order to movement you're capturing is the movement of the eyes. So I think that's remarkable if they can do it online. And one of the things I would be curious about is how good are those measurements? Like how precise are they? How much error is there? Given that presumably people at home are doing, moving their heads and doing whatever as they're looking at whatever's on the screen. But
yeah, I think precision has been, here's Christina's question. Yeah, I think precision has been one of the issues, but it's been helpful for some studies, for this new online research environment where you can't actually work with your subjects, in person.
Yeah.
So here's a question. Regarding the results that found that negative thoughts may have either been more persistent following onset of negative thoughts or more recurrent when the thoughts may have resurfaced later on, did subjects fall into different categories for this? For example, one person exhibited recurring thought patterns consistently, or did you find that one subject may have exhibited both of these behaviors at different time points?
It's a really excellent question. It's not something that we've looked at in depth yet. I have kind of a working hypothesis that different individuals have signature styles, and that there may be some individuals who are more prone to chronic, persistent negative thoughts, whereas others, perhaps due to greater control over thoughts, or perhaps more of a desire to try to control the thoughts, are able to exert control over a short period of time and then kind of are unable to sustain thoughts recur. It could also have to do with the environments people are in. So individuals, for example, some individuals we see clinically limited roles. So these are individuals who are disabled, who are at home all the time, and they may have very little happening in their daily life. Especially individuals who are depressed and who are, just at home, sometimes even in bed, and not motivated to engage in various activities. And so there's very little going on to interrupt that thought process. Whereas others who are at work or taking care of children or, engaging in other activities may have external stimuli that are demanding their attention and drawing their attention away from the thought process. when that demand is removed, the thoughts return to the things that they were worrying or ruminating about. So my working hypothesis is that there are some individual differences in the patterns of thought people have, and we do have the data available to look at that. I'm curious to know in the daily life data that I mentioned, but also using the joystick. I just haven't had a chance to look at the data at that level yet. We've been looking more at sort of processes like external variables that are predicting different pattern of responding as opposed to a with in-person patterns. But that's something that I intend to look at later. It's a great question.
And then also just, I guess I'm curious, we can see an age breakdown, but is there, this is me speaking as a mother, as a mother during pandemic.
Yes,
so,
indeed.
Are there times during life where we see that this, is the worrying, is the GAD worrying, is that like, does that evolve over time, or is that the kind of thing that you'll be diagnosed with and then you need to treat it, I guess with cognitive behavioral therapy or with medication?
So you're wondering about whether there are certain periods in someone's life when they're more prone to developing GAD? Yes. So that's also an excellent question. The research is fuzzy on this. We know that GAD generally has a later average age of onset than most other anxiety disorders. So disorders like phobias, for example, tend to first begin in childhood or early. By contrast, the average median age of onset is in adulthood. There is some research in clinical samples suggesting that that average is actually masking a bimodal age of onset distribution, that there are some individuals who first develop GAD in childhood, and these are the individuals who always been a worrier. This is the way I am. And they really feel like that GAD and that worry is really part of their temperament, part of who they are, and not changeable. Other people seem to develop GAD in adulthood as a response to some significant persistent stressor in their life. So, an individual, for example, who's sort of has not generally been a worrier, or at least not a person who has difficulty controlling their worry, might be, for example, I give an example, my abnormal psychology class of a client I saw who had a serious heart attack and had to have quintuple bypass surgery. And he had a family history of individuals in his family who had died quite young from heart disease. And so he basically developed GAD in the context of this very significant stressor where he had real fear about dying, about what will happen to my family if I die, and sort of this sort of spread to encompass other topics of worry in his life as well. So there's more we need to learn about when GAD begins. I think that actually could really help point us to sort of better a theoretical understanding of the causes of the disorder. I think also there's sort of separate questions about when does high worry begin and when does GAD begin, because my suspicion is that there's many people who are temperamentally predisposed to worrying quite a lot, but it's only under certain environmental conditions, like when the stress level gets high enough that they might tip over from what we would consider normal but high worry into GAD. And in terms of what people worry about, which I think is part of what you're asking about, at every single developmental stage, people worry about something. What they worry about tends to differ, but the actual level of worry doesn't seem to be substantially higher in the general population at different ages. It's just that, teens worry about peers and romantic partners, and middle adults, we worry about our aging parents and our young kids, and in older life, people worry about their health and their loved ones dying. There's always something to worry about, and the question really is, with worry, this is one of the things that fascinates, and I think is fascinating about it, is that it is part of life, and so then the question is, well, at what point do we say that's really a problem? And currently, as you saw from my early slides, we say it's a problem when the person feels like it is excessive relative to the actual circumstance and they can't control it, they can't turn it off, and as a result, they can't sleep, they can't concentrate at work, and they're very unable to function. But different people's tipping points may be different depending on their other resources that they have to bear and other stressors they have to deal with.
Well, this was super fascinating and incredibly timely because I think we are all feeling, you know, if not our own worry, at least empathy, I guess, because yeah, I mean, we've all had periods of worry in the last few weeks or maybe just yesterday. So
one of the reasons I enjoy studying anxiety, it is always pertinent, maybe particularly during a pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, I would really like it to be a little less pertinent right now. But
yes, indeed.
but yes, it is super fascinating. And so thank you very much for your time again today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. And then just for anyone who's still here, this talk was recorded today, so you're welcome to share it. And I believe that's all. So thanks again. Have a good rest of your week, a worry-free remainder to your week, if that's possible.
Or at least a well-controlled worry week. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking to be what was it, a super worrier, a super normal. Have a super normal.
Super normal week to all of you, for sure.
Super normal week to you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.